Son, and the Holy Spirit. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. I hope you're all doing well this Lent so far and you're enjoying the Desert Fathers. So we'll continue now and give me a word, page 142 in John Kolovos. So we're on S2. So this is where it says, the same elder said to his brother, even though we are sadly impoverished in the sight of folk, let us rejoice in the way we are honored in the presence of God. And so this is actually an interesting thing he's saying, is because what he's pointing out is that in the old days, to be a monk was actually a very sort of humiliating, embarrassing kind of thing. It was like, because when you're a monk in the old days, you're really living a life of poverty. You're giving up everything. You're going to be not being able to eat much, to be able to do your own will. It's a very limiting kind of thing. And in those days, it wasn't a glorious thing. So, for example, when people would tell their parents in the old days, I decided to become a monk, the parents' reaction would be like, oh, anything but that. Oh, you stabbed us in the heart. You're just throwing your life away. Of course, I mean, that's something that can still happen today. I mean, in fact, it has. Would you mind closing the door? It is something that, in fact, even my own mother said that to me when I told her I wanted to be a monk. She said, "Well, if you want to throw your life away, go ahead." But nowadays it's also become almost a glory. Was in the eyes of many people, it's like a glorious, great thing to become a monk, and it's something that people would even boast about. And for example, and in fact, I'll tell you a story about, there's one person who came to St. Anthony's Monastery. That was years ago, like 15, 20 years ago. And he was in, yeah, have a seat. And as soon as he became a novice, and by the way, when you're a novice in most monasteries like St. Anthony, what happens is you stop wearing the clothes of a lay person. You start wearing these, the cassock and the vest. You don't wear the veil, because that's only for a monk, a tonsured monk, but you do sort of look like a monk, and it's sort of, a thing that is known that you're a novice. So anyway, so there's this one guy from a parish not too far away from St. Anthony's, and as soon as he became a novice, the very next day he said, because he was confessing his thoughts to me, he said, I'm going to leave tomorrow. I decided to leave. I was like, wait, you just became a novice just like literally one day ago, and you're leaving already? I mean, what's wrong? I mean, was it too hard for you all of a sudden? I mean, what's the sudden change? And he said, oh, well, I have to be really honest with you. He said, well, in my parish, which was a parish that was very close to the monastery, I mean, spiritually close to the monastery, they put an announcement in their weekly bulletin that so and so, who used to be a parishioner of theirs, became a novice at St. Anthony's. And he said, see, that's what I really wanted. What I really wanted was to receive glory from people that, I made it. I'm on track spiritually, so that I can sort of have my head up high. And so now that I have that badge, so I decided to leave.
Oh,
yeah. So I mean, you get all types, really. So, but I mean, to his credit, though, I mean, he's I mean, I still know him, and he's going to church. He's still a very faithful person, and he has kids, and his kids are, on track spiritually. So yeah, so I mean, we all have our weaknesses, but yeah, so what the point is that nowadays it's kind of things are backwards, in the sense that now it's a glorious thing to become monk, which is, I mean, of course it's good for lay people to show reverence to people who are dedicated their lives to Christ in this way, but it's not so good for the monastics for themselves to have this air about them that say, okay, I'm special, I should go first in line, I should get all the special treatment. Hey, how come you're not, paying attention to me or listening to me, all that kind of, it's, and so it can be a real temptation. I mean, not only first for a novice who's just becoming, but also for monks themselves, because because people do honor monks, and of course it's a good thing to honor monks. It's just that it's so very easy for it to go to our heads. So, but anyway, getting back to the book here, Saint John the Kolovos is pointing out that even though people are looking down on us for being monks, we should rejoice and take courage, knowing that we're honored in the presence of God. So that's the sense of what's going on in this verse here. Okay, so now moving on to the next one, John Kolovos number 3, S3 on page 142. He says that the holy ones, in other words, holy people, saints, are like a garden of trees bearing different fruits, but irrigated by the same water. And he says the activity of one holy one, the one of one holy elder or saint, is different from that of another, even though there's just the same spirit and work in them all. And so what this is talking about is the reality that different saints are very different from each other. They don't become carbon copies of each other. And this is something that we see very clearly when we read the lives of the saints. We see, for example, that Saint, for example, Saint Ephrem of Catanakia, he was living out in the wilderness, and he had his peace and quiet. And whereas Saint Porphyrius had streams of people coming to him every day, but also their character was very different. I mean, like Saint Joseph of Hesychast, he was a very sort of an austere kind of person, whereas his disciple Elder Ephrem was a very gentle, sweet kind of person. Even though, and so this was not because Elder Ephrem was not a good disciple of his Elder Saint Joseph. It's just that what ends up happening is when a person becomes full of the Holy Spirit, then they live up to the potential of who they've been created to be. The unique person that they've been created becomes highlighted, and so that they become very unique but very beautiful. And of course, in some ways they're very identical. For example, all of the saints are very loving, all of them are very humble, all of them are very patient. But then in terms of their character, you'll see great differences between the saints. Yeah, and so that's also why that the job, in a sense, that the task of a spiritual father is not for him to try to make his disciples become carbon copies of himself, but the job of a spiritual father is to try to inspire people to become the unique person that they are called to be, which is, as we were saying, very different for each person. Okay, so moving on to the bottom of page 142, John Kolovos S4, he's saying, if a person has something of God in his soul, in other words, he has consolation from God, he has some grace from God in his soul, he can remain in his cell, in other words, locked up in his cabin all day, even though he doesn't have anything of this world, even though he's lacking all of the natural thing, the basic needs that most people would depend upon. And also, he says, if a person has something of this world and nothing of God, he too can remain in his cell because he has something of this world. In other words, he's all set. He's got his refrigerator full. He's got all he's got plenty of clothes. He has plenty of whatever. And so he's fine, even though he doesn't have any connection with God. He's happy just, in his luxurious little cell there. But then he says, if someone has neither something of God, in other words, he neither has God's grace nor the human consolations, well, then he won't be able to stay in his cell at all. And that just goes to show this is just human nature. So, I mean, we all have fundamental human needs. We all need, for example, food and water and shelter and the things to keep us busy. We need to be creative. We need to have challenges that we can overcome. These are just on a human level. We're all the same like that. But when we have God's grace, then even if we lack some of those things, then we can still be okay. And this is what we see very clearly in the lives of many of these desert fathers and in the saints in general, where we see that they sometimes, they didn't have enough clothes and they're freezing or they're burning up in the desert, or they didn't have enough food, or whatever it was. But even though they lacked all these things, God's grace was so powerful and so present in their lives that they didn't even mind. And so this is a very important thing, that to know that when we can have God's grace, when we're with God, that's when we have true peace and joy, and also a freedom from being dependent on these worldly things, which are very, fickle, in the sense that you can have a lot of food and clothes and riches now, but then tomorrow you lose it all. Whereas God's grace is something that can stay with you, of course, as long as you don't lose it by sinning or something. Okay.
But Father,
Yes. Yes.
May I please ask you,
Yeah.
what is an example of a person or people who have nothing of this world and nothing of God?
Yes. Yeah. So this would be example. Let's say a person decides to leave all his worldly belongings and go become a hermit, and struggle to become to live spiritually as a monk out in the middle of nowhere, in the forest. And if this person isn't living spiritually, let's say he just wastes his time, whatever, daydreaming or whatever, then this person won't have any divine consolation from his prayer, from his connection with God. And he won't have human consolation either, because he doesn't have any people to interact with, and he doesn't have, barely has enough food, barely has enough clothes. So yeah, so this is, and I suppose this could also happen to even someone who's not a hermit, someone who's, let's say, very, poor, financially struggling in the world. If this person is not on track spiritually, if they're not trying to be close to God, if they're not confessing, they're not receiving communion, then this person could be lacking both material and spiritual good things, in which case they'll be, in very much stress and struggle, and there'll be a real challenge for them just to survive.
Like an atheist.
Yeah, and so people who don't have God, I mean, for the most part, people who don't have God, they'll look for consolation in worldly things. So they might have whether it might be something sinful like drugs or some sinful bad habit, or it could be also just some neutral thing that gives them joy. They could like build model airplanes all day, and that gives them some sort of joy. But of course, it's a very sort of empty kind of joy. It's not going to really satisfy them. Yeah. Okay. So on 143 now, I'll skip the first one, the second one, S6. He says, one of the elders says to this elder, Saint John Colovo, he says, John, you're like a prostitute who makes herself beautiful, increasing the number of her lovers. And so Abba John put his arm around him and said, what you say is true, Father. And so what the reason this other elder was telling him this is because this Saint John Colavos, he was a well-known elder among all the monks there, and people would come to him for advice and spiritual guidance and everything, and he would welcome them and speak to them, and he would become famous and he'd be very popular. And so in that sense, he's constantly increasing the number of people coming to him. And so this other elder seemed to be maybe a little jealous and said, you're just like a prostitute, trying to get more and more lovers. Of course, not in the physical sense, but then Abba John says, yes, you're right. Yes, he didn't try to say, what do you mean a prostitute? I'm a monk. What do you do? But then his disciple, the disciple of Elder John, this Saint John, heard this and afterward asked him, were you not troubled with inside yourself, Father? And he said, no. He said, for the way I am on the outside, the way I am on the inside. In other words, he didn't need to pretend not to be troubled. He genuinely was not troubled. And so when he said, yes, what you say is true, Father, to this father who came out of jealousy to say, prostitute, he was genuinely not troubled. And so the reason why he wasn't troubled, of course, is because he had a deep sense of self-awareness, and he was someone who was already constantly blaming himself. In other words, and this is something that Elder Ephraim taught us. Elder Ephraim taught us all day long, we need to be constantly humiliating ourselves and reproaching ourselves and blaming ourselves and putting ourselves down, which is kind of the opposite of what we tend to do. I mean, what we tend to do is think to ourselves after, let's say I did something, I say, wow, I really did that well. And then you cook something, you say, wow, I ate that was perfect. I really nailed it. And then, we sort of constantly, beef up our ego in our inner thoughts without even realizing it. But what Elder Ephraim and the Holy Father are saying is we actually should be doing the opposite. We should be constantly berating ourselves and humbling ourselves, because this is what's going to give us humility, and it will protect us from times that other people insult us. Because, in other words, if I'm all day hearing myself belittling myself, then someone else comes along and belittles me, it'll be like, oh yeah, I agree. That's how I am. And so as you get used to it, and so it becomes very easy to hear insults. And it is a very beautiful state to be in, because when you can be in a state sort of already so low, you're already down on the ground, for example, there's no way you can fall off the ground, and you're already down as low as you can be, and so you're very safe from being insulted and from any kind of undesirable thing. And so this is the beauty of the virtue of humility. But of course, as we've been saying before, the only thing we have to watch out for when we are belittling ourselves constantly is to make sure that we're not slipping into this depression kind of thing, where we're getting discouraged and feeling, oh, I'm just such a loser, why even try? Then that's dangerous. So we do have to watch out for that. Okay, so we can move on now to page 144. And there's Isidore the priest at Skete. And so it says here that if there was anyone in the Skete, in other words, the monastery there, where there was a brother, a monk, who was contradictory, contemptuous, or insolent, he would, and they wanted to throw him out, he would say, bring him here to me. And he would take in this brother or this novice, and then save him through his long-suffering patience. And so what's going on here is that there's the Holy Fathers, the monastic fathers of the church warn against having someone in the monastery who has passions that are contagious, because there are some passions that are contagious and some that aren't. Just like there are some physical illnesses that you can be contagious, like the flu or a virus or whatever, but others that are not contagious. So if you have like cancer, obviously you're not going to catch it from another person. And the same thing applies also with spiritual illnesses. So for example, if I'm a glutton, for example, it's probably not, I'm probably not going to affect other people and make them into gluttons if they're, let's say, living in the same house as me or whatever. It's not really a contagious passion. Whereas if I have the passion of anger, for example, and I'm constantly blowing up and getting disturbed, well, that's the kind of thing that is likely to affect other people. And I'm sure you've seen it in your own experience. Whenever you're around someone who's angry, they tend to make you angry too, and it sort of brings out the worst in you.
Or gossip, we do the same thing.
Yeah, and gossip. Yeah, that's not a big one. Yeah. So that's very contagious. And so because of this, the Holy Fathers would say if someone has a contagious passion like anger, you have to kick him out of the monastery. And so, whereas here, with this Saint Isidore of the Skeet, he was someone who was so above all these passions that he would take in all these people that had these contagious passions, and he would, through his patience and love and humility, he would be able to save these people. So it's sort of like a doctor who is so physically robust, he's not afraid to go in and heal the lepers and whatever because he's strong enough. Okay, so now the third one here, Isidore of Skeet 3 on page 144. It said he used to say that for 40 years he was aware of sin in his mind, and he had never given in either to lust or to anger. And so what this means is that for 40 years, he was aware that this temptation, to lust and the temptation to anger, they are constantly from time to time, at least, they're coming and attacking with thoughts, and it wasn't like he was free of these passions. These two passions had him. He was as a real struggle, but because he was so watchful, he was so careful with his thoughts, he was able not to give into either of these two passions. And then finally, after 40 years of this battle, finally he overcame it, and these temptations stopped attacking him. And so, of course, this is really amazing to hear how patient he was and how much he insisted on this struggle. But it also goes to show how important it is to be watchful with our thoughts. And one of the most amazing quotes of the Holy Fathers I've read is the following. It says, perfect watchfulness, nipsis, perfect watchfulness equals perfect sinlessness. So in other words, if you can be perfectly watchful with your thoughts, which means every time a bad thought comes, you catch it and recognize it for what it is. So for example, let's say someone, whatever, cuts you off on the road, and you feel the anger boiling up inside you, and you want to, whatever, honk your horn or yell at them, or even just sort of kind of internally, if you are aware, you say, hey, wait a second, what's going on inside me? Oh, this is anger. I can tell by the feeling and by how my body's reacting. I can tell this anger, or I can tell just by my thoughts how it's all against this person. And so you catch it, you see it for what it is, and say, hey, wait a second. Is anger something I want? Is this something that's going to do me or the other person any good? Well, obviously no. It's something I'm going to regret also, because every time I do something or say something out of anger, it's always backfires. It never is accepted. It's never, well received. And so you say, okay, well, therefore I don't want this anger. I don't want to be an angry person. I want to be a kind person. I want to be a patient person. And so you overcome this desire to give in, and then you get a little grace for this. And so, but we first have to recognize that what it is that's attacking us. Because if I don't see that I'm being pushed into anger, I just give in to this desire to explode. Well, then I'm not getting anywhere. And so this applies really to all passions, whether it's lust or gluttony or selfishness. It always first comes as a thought that we need to recognize. And that's why when we go to confession, it's important to confess not just the things we've done and said, but even the thoughts, because the thoughts are what end up growing into a word or some bad words or bad actions. Okay, so is that clear? All right.
Yeah, Father.
Yes, Tim.
Yeah. Excuse me, just two quick things. Okay, so even if we are plagued with the same temptations for years, it's pleasing to God, who allows them, I guess, if we just see them, we just watch them, and then, as you say, take the other fork in the road, cut them off. And so not to give up hope or despair if the same thing happens for decades.
Yeah, and that's exactly because as I'm sure we all know, it can literally be decades that we're struggling against the passion, because the passions, they do have deep roots, and it can take a lot of time. But the beautiful thing is that even though we might be struggling even to the very moment we pass from this life, that still is actually there's still very much hope for us, because there's something that Saint Isaac the Syrian said is it's very important. He says, if a person is struggling to reach perfection, dies, in other words, God takes a person out of this life before they reach perfection, God will put this person along with the perfect. In other words, he'll put him in heaven if God saw that that's the direction he was going. Because, so in other words, we don't have to reach perfection. We don't have to become saints in this life. It's good enough for us to be making a continual effort, and God sees this and accepts this as our expression of love for him. And so it's not within, it might not be within our power to completely overcome some weakness, some passion, but it is within our power to resist it every time it comes. And if we do that, well, then God can save us and put us with the perfect.
Great, thank you. And just the one other thing is quicker.
Yeah.
What was the rationalization or justification? What was the argument for somebody accusing that saint of being like a whore? What, because he was attracting people, or what was the case?
Yeah. So what happened was this Saint John Colavos, he was someone who was so popular that more and more people would go to him for advice and guidance and stuff. And this other monk saw that he was getting more and more people, getting more and more popular. And this other monk was getting jealous, apparently, and said he accused him of being like a prostitute who tries to get as many lovers as possible. And so that was the gist of it.
Okay, thank you. I just wondered what his scam rationalization was. Got it. Thank you.
Papa Fem, sorry, one question. Your
Yes.
blessings, Papa Fem.
Hello, Johanna.
Question. So back on the struggle. So in the end, we may never ever get rid of our passions. So I have kind of a two question. Sometimes is it maybe that the Lord will allow it to continue humbling us throughout our lives? Because if we start tackling every passion, then we think all of a sudden we're these big saints and then we can lose everything. Is that maybe one reason why the Lord allows it?
Yeah, it is. In fact, and this is something Saint Paisius of the Holy Mount said something very interesting. He said that we put God in a very difficult position, because on the one hand, God wants to give us all the graces, all the gifts of the Holy Spirit. He wants to just have us overflowing with grace and these spiritual gifts, charismas. But on the other hand, God knows that if he were to do that, we would get so puffed up and so prideful because we'd see, wow, I've raised the dead with my prayer. I've made this miracle. I've done that. I've helped this person. I helped that person. Wow, I must be great. And then, of course, then we become like little Lucifers, in the sense that we take the credit for ourselves and then end up being far from God because we're not grateful to God and giving him the credit. So St. Pius says we put God in a tough position because he wants to give us all this grace, but he knows he can't. And so it's true that God allows us to have these struggles, especially so that we can have a more deep humility and realize that we really can do nothing without Christ.
So if the Lord sees a soul struggling, for example, a simple, like we all judge, we all have it, whether we want to admit it or not, everyone judges, we'll have a judgmental thought. So if someone who really struggles with this or gossip or whatever, their whole life by trying to avoid it, trying to, not partake in conversation, try to like cut these thoughts off.
Yeah.
Like you said, though we will never reach perfection, what the Lord sees is the actual struggle. And is that what actually will save us in the end? Like we fall, we get up, we fall, get up. Is that what the whole, if you think about it, it's really simple, but then we make it complicated in our heads. Like we fall, we get up and continue to the last breath of our lives, just repent. Is that what this whole thing is all about in the end, about, for us to be saved?
So it's the way I would put it, it's all about love. So one of the Holy Fathers says that at the end of our life, God will ask us only one thing. Do you love me? Did you love me? And And the answer to this question will be clear from the way we lived our life. So if I genuinely did love Christ, then every time something that Christ wouldn't like a sinful thought or deed or word comes, every time this comes, I would fight against it. I might not always win, but there'll be the sincere desire to resist it. And so of course, if a person has very strong love for Christ, it's not unusual for that person to completely eradicate some passion, or maybe even all the passions. But if our love isn't quite that strong, but it's medium, well, it's good enough, but it just that the result will be that we might not totally eradicate the passion, we might totally uproot them, but at least we'll be, holding the fort and keeping up the battle.
So the Lord is okay if we're never be perfect, as long as we're just struggling. Because we
So-
always try strive to make him happy, and we've got to do this, we've got to do that. But I mean, I'll speak for myself. I'm so weak, I can't even handle it for more than an hour sometimes. So that's what I'm saying. He's aware of that, and we shouldn't be so hard on ourselves.
Yeah, so I'll say two things. I mean, God, I wouldn't say he's okay with us being imperfect. I would say that he does want us to reach perfection, but also he's realistic. He knows what we can and can't do. So God does want us to have such a burning love for him that we do overcome these things. But if in the case that we don't have that intensity of love for him, well, that's good enough. It's still good enough for salvation. And yeah, so that's what I'd say about that.
Sorry, one last thing. I'm sorry, but when you say intensity of love, can it be just that we're just weak sometimes? Because you want to love him, you have it inside to love him, but I mean, we all have different life situations. I mean, whatever that may be, that sometimes we're just not strong enough, if that makes sense. Doesn't mean we don't want to love him, it's just we're not strong enough. That's what I meant with weaknesses.
So I guess the way I see all of our weaknesses is that the reason why we're weak is because our love for God isn't as strong as it could be, and on the contrary, our love for something else is stronger than it should be. For example, let's say judgmental thoughts. For example, if I truly had very strong love, not only for Christ, but especially for my other fellow human beings, every time someone else did something bad, or I was told in gossip sort of way about someone else doing something bad, if I genuinely have a deep love for this other person, there'd be nothing in me that would enjoy gossiping about this person. I'd just genuinely be sad from the bottom of my heart that this other person is doing something that's not okay. Mm-hmm. And so there'd be not an ounce of me interested in gossiping or focusing on his failures, because in the same way, I don't want to gossip about my own failures. And so in that sense, I do see our tendency to judge or to gossip or any passion. I do see it as there's too much self-love, and we get a little bit of pleasure out of gossiping about other people, or a little bit of pleasure in getting angry, or get a little pleasure of gluttony or lust, whatever it is. And so this love of pleasure that we're going to feel by giving into the passion is what's taking away from our love from God. So, I mean, maybe there's just semantics. I mean, maybe you could just say this is what it means to be weak. But I think a more theologically overarching way to say a person is weak is that they have more love for themselves than for God and for their neighbor. Mm-hmm. Yes.
And how do we overcome that?
So, okay. Yeah.
How do we overcome
self-love? Yeah. So the question, yeah. So she asked, Nikki asked, how do you overcome self-love? Yeah, and that's like the $1 million question.
Mm-hmm.
How do we overcome our love for ourselves and learn to love God with all our heart and to love our neighbors ourselves? That's if we get the answer to that question, we're good to go. We're golden. And so, but this is, so when we look in the writings of the Holy Fathers about the spiritual life, this is basically what they're trying to address. They're trying to say, how can we overcome our self-love and learn to love God and to learn to love our neighbor? And so it's a real, I would say it's a whole science. It's a whole, like for example, the book, The Ladder of Divine Ascent, which is something, it's sort of like the textbook, the on Orthodox spirituality. And what it does is it goes into sort of, I would say almost medical precision, like scientific precision, exactly how it is that the passions interact, how it is that our self-love steals from us in this way and that way, how it is that we get tricked by the demons. And so all these things, it really is a science that is to be studied. And that's what monks especially are trying to focus on, this, how can we outsmart ourselves and train ourselves to love God and to love our neighbor and to resist all of these subtle ways, these subtle versions of self-love.
Father?
Sub question, but
Oh, just 1 second, Tim.
Sure.
so sub question would be like for the monks, it's 100% towards loving God.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, hold it
monks-
close to your mouth.
For monks, it's 100% like just loving God. For marriage, is like if you leave self-love and love completely the other person, does that count as loving God?
Yeah. So for both monastics and lay people, our calling is exactly what it says in the Bible, to love God with all our heart and to love our neighbor as ourselves. Now, the way that will look for a monk is that he'll love God, he'll express his love for God, especially through prayer, through going to the church service, but also through his obedience to his elder and his loving the neighbor. He'll, he'll struggle to love all the other monks in the monastery and lay people if he interacts with them. Whereas for a lay person, let's say a married lay person, again, they also are called to love God with their whole heart, but also to love their neighbors and to have as their spouse, as someone they're working together with on their salvation. And so, and obviously there's love is it needs to be the foundation of that connection with the spouse. So there is definitely a much more focus on the personal connection there, and for a married person. I don't know, did I answer your question?
No, it's like the struggle to love the other person than loving yourself.
Yeah, because, and this I'm sure all you can speak to much better than I can. To be married, it is a tremendous sacrifice to be able to say, okay, I'm gonna try to love this person more than myself. I'm gonna try to do things the other person's way as much as possible, and I'm not gonna insist on my own way. And it is a real martyrdom at times, and that's why the Holy Fathers say that a person is given crowns when they're married, because those are the crowns of the martyr. It's a very hard thing to be married and to sacrifice your will and put yourself below the other person. Yeah. Yes, Anthony.
Sometimes, when we talk about loving our neighbor, there seems to be, there's a difficulty though too, when you say, what is loving your neighbor and what is being a fool? Because I'll just give a real life example. Right now, I'm having an issue with a neighbor over parking.
Yeah, but can you guys?
They want to park. They want to rent some space from me. But they want to rent some space for me.
Yeah.
But after we're doing more thinking about it,
Yeah.
I really don't want their problem of lack of space become my problem. And I don't want to create issues then for tenants who are getting ready to move into this property and just create an issue. So though, there's love for your neighbor, I'm at the point where I'm kind of like, well, it's better to just say, you know what, right now the circumstances just don't allow us to rent anything and just leave it at that way. You have your space, we kind of have our space, because I don't want it to turn it into later it becomes like an obligation.
Yeah.
And I start feeling then that I'm the one being taken advantage of. Not that you know, there are
Yeah.
times, you just let things go, but I think there's sometimes where there is a fine line of what is loving your neighbor versus what is just
Yeah.
acquiescing and just rolling over.
Yeah, definitely. And the thing about, I mean, love is obviously one of the words that's very much misunderstood nowadays. Some people think love means doing whatever the other person wants and just submitting and letting them walk all over you. And that really isn't love. I mean, that's I mean, you're spoiling the other person, but also you're setting yourself up for something in the future to be something beyond what you can bear. It can, especially if the person tends to be abusive or whatever. So yeah, so I would agree that loving your neighbor doesn't mean always being nice to your neighbor. I mean, you can be firm, not in a mean way, but you can be firm. And this is something that's probably self-evident to any of you who have raised children. You know that being nice to your kid isn't always the most loving thing. I mean, you need to be strict. Well, there's dad's looking at her daughter right now. But anyway, but yeah, sometimes love, means saying no. And so yeah, so I agree that yeah, you do need to be able to say no to be loving and to survive in the world.
But
Yes.
what about those examples in the Desert Fathers, like the guy who runs after the thief, and gives him like the paintings, or you'll hear some of them in stories. They'll say like a married woman, her husband was cheating, but she stayed in the house and took care of everything. How do we balance those?
Yeah. So it's true that there are many examples from the Holy Fathers where a person would go beyond, or they would let the other person take advantage of them. So, for example, that's that time when a monk was being robbed by some people, and then they forgot to take something, so he came running after them and say, "Hey, you forgot this," and so there are exceptions like that, but people will do this only when they can see that they have the ability to bear this, to lay down their life for their neighbor in that sense. I mean, Christ said, no one has greater love than to lay down their life for their neighbor, and others to sacrifice everything for their neighbor. And now this is something that can be done when a person has a lot of grace and can do it wholeheartedly, but then the problem starts happening is a person doesn't have that grace and then tries to do sort of bite off more than they can chew. And then later down the line, they start saying, "Oh, why did I give them away everything? Why did I let this person abuse me? Why did I, And so that's why it definitely takes moderation and also knowing ourselves to know, am I able to lay down my life now for this person, or am I going to have regrets further down the line? So, but I will still say that a parent shouldn't, spoil their kids in order to cut off their own will and sort of be the humble one. A parent needs to be firm, and by extension, if we're in a position in society where we have some authority over other people or other objects, again, we need to be firm at times, even though it does come across as being the bad guy, the meanie or something.
Father, may I ask you a simpler question?
Yes. Okay. Good.
How coming back to the falling and get up, falling and get up.
Falling up and down. Yeah, going up and down. Yeah, getting.
So how do we overcome the shame or the embarrassment that we feel, especially when we go to confession and we say, I did it again and again, and I mean, how can we? Because at some point, if we fall, we get up, we fall, we get up. We go to confession, we confess the same sin all over and over, and at some point, this conversation might become like, an automatic conversation, like, I did it again. Oh, I know you would. Okay, thank you. So, how do we, get out of that circle, embarrassment circle?
Yeah, so I would say that there's two traps we have to avoid in this kind of thing. One trap is to just say, to take it for granted that I'm just going to keep on sinning, so I'm not going to really try to resist, and so that'd be sort of a lazy sort of approach to the spiritual life, and say, well, I'm not going to really try to resist this sin because I know I'm going to give in to it. But and then the other side, there's a temptation to be so embarrassed about it that you stop confessing it, for example. And of course, both of these are neither of these are really healthy. I would say one thing about embarrassment in confession is of course, we all feel that it's natural, but I would say that there's two kinds of shame. There's a healthy and an unhealthy kind of shame. We should feel shame with sin because it's something that helps us to want to resist it. Like I know there's this one, there was a monk at St. Anthony's who, when he was a teenager, he fell into a certain sin that was very embarrassing. And he said that when he confessed it, it was just so terribly embarrassing to confess it that he determined never to do it again, and he didn't. And so that kind of shame can actually be very helpful in our spiritual life. But then if we have so much shame that we're not able to confess it, well, then that's a real problem, because it's like saying, okay, I can't admit to the doctor that I've got this whatever illness it is. So what I would advise that kind of person is that they'd have to find another doctor that they could confess it to, because these kinds of wounds, they fester and they get worse and worse if you don't confess them. And so it'd be crucial to at least find someone you can confess it to, so that you can get it out and be cleansed of it. Yeah, so yeah, that's what I have to say.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so were you gonna say something, Tim, or did I cut you off, or you're all set there? I guess I muted him, so we can't talk. Okay, never mind.
Can you hear? Oh, can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, there you are.
Thank you so much for coming back. Yeah, at one point you were talking about how, there's sort of almost a science of how the different passions and demons interact and, interplay, whatever. Were you saying there's some treatise on that? I mean, I think I've seen maybe St. John Cassian or somebody, but I always wonder, well, this is just one guy's view, but is there any kind of a, treatise you'd recommend on?
Yeah, so the classic text that I mentioned is St. John of the Ladder, the St. John Climacus. And this is such a classic, as you may know. This is a book that's read every Lent in monasteries from cover to cover, and it's
the Ladder.
The Ladder, yeah, the Ladder of Divine. Yeah, and so something that, because it's such a deep book and it has such tremendous insights, that even though we monks have heard it, dozens of times, we still need to hear it again and again, because it's something that it's not nothing to hear. Well, it's just sort of like the Bible, in a sense that you can hear it. We all know what the Bible says, but that doesn't mean we're not benefited by hearing it again. So the Ladder of Divine Ascent is one book that stands out as being especially helpful, but really a lot of the Holy Fathers, right? Like, for example, the book we read before this, Abba Dorotheos, this is it's a book similar in content to the Ladder of Divine Ascent, in the sense that it talks about how the passions and the virtues interact, and how it is they outsmart us. How can we outsmart the passions and things like that? So yeah, so there are several books like that.
Okay, yeah, that was looking for sort of any of your faves, as it were. So, okay, yeah. Ladder of Divine Ascent, and what we already were blessed to read. Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah,
and especially, as you said, it's okay to just keep going back to the Ladder every Lent, huh?
Yeah, and even if we don't read the whole thing, just a few pages a day, or just a page a day, that could be a real, a real inspiration.
Okay, thanks so much.
Papa for them.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yes, hello, Nakaria.
Oh, Evelita, I have a question, but I think someone else popped on too.
Oh, well, you go ahead.
Okay. My question was about what you were just talking about with firm and humbleness. How can you put that in respect to like parent and child? Because I know I have authority over my children. I want to be firm with them, but sometimes allowing them to do what they want just keeps the peace. So when is that looked on as, you know, I'm not trying to just simply give them their way and be humble. I want to be firm, but where's the line of like firmness?
Yeah, and I mean, and again, I feel a little out of place talking about how to be a parent, but I would say that yeah, you definitely, there has to be a give and take, and there has to be times when to pick your battles and say, okay, this is something that's very important. This is something I can't give in on. And so I'm going to be firm here, even though you're going to complain about it all day. But then other things you can say, well, it doesn't really matter that much on this particular thing they want. Okay, even though I don't really think it's the best thing, I'll give in. And so, as you say, it can be wise just to let them have their way in many things, as long as you see that it's minor, it's not that big a deal.
Papa Fram?
Yes, Angel.
Hi, God bless you, Father. Thank you for coming back. I echo the sentiments. It's a joy to have you. Might you ever consider having in the book club the St. John letter, by descent, or is that a little bit too too deep?
Yes, it's a really intense book. I mean, intense in the sense that for us to go through it the way we're going through this book, I mean, it could be like years, maybe.
Yes.
But yeah, so right now where we are we're like one page, we're almost we're exactly halfway through the book right now. So of this, give me a word. So I think what we'll do is we'll first finish this, and then take, because maybe after this you guys will want something a little lighter, like something that's just more like a story that we can, because like here we're getting through only a couple pages a day, and it's whereas maybe you'd prefer a book where it's actually like the life of a saint, where we're like reading like more. But anyway, so we'll keep it. Well, I guess we'll have a vote or something when we're done this book, and see what, if you guys have any favorites that you want to try to tackle.
God bless you. Thank you.
And then we vote.
Yeah, I can. It can be. Yeah, we can put a list of potential books, and we can vote whichever one gets the. Yeah. Yeah.
Not that I'm an impatient, but I'm guilty.
Sorry. Okay, so let's.
But if you do the latter, that means you're gonna have it for a long time.
Oh yeah. Okay, so so at the bottom of 144 and top 145, they're talking about this Abba Isidore, and his logismi, his thoughts, would say to him, "Oh, you're a great man." And the way he would, in other words, that he had thoughts of pride, saying that they would say to him, "Oh, you're great, just you're a wonderful monk," blah blah blah, to try to puff him up. And so he would answer these thoughts. Well, wait a second. Am I like Saint Anthony the Great, or have I become like Abba Pambo or the rest of the Holy Fathers? And then when he reminded himself of these greats, these truly great saints that he was obvious that he could see he was nothing like them, he wasn't at their level, it said he experienced repose. So he was able to be at peace that he wasn't such a great person by reminding himself that, well, I'm not as great as these other saints, so I don't need to be prideful. And then on the contrary, the enemy that with his thoughts used to discourage him, saying that after all his life of a monk, he would end up being cast into hell forever. And then the way he would deal with that thought was like this. He'd say, even if I am cast into chastisement, into hell, in other words, I will find you, the devil, beneath me. So what he's doing here, this Saint Isidore of Ski, he was, every time he had some thought, he would deal with it accordingly. and it's the Holy Fathers compare this situation to we're trying to be on a road, stay on a road that has ditches on both sides, and so we got the steering wheel, and we're trying to keep our vehicle on the road, but the demons come in with their thoughts and try to make us steer off to the right or veer off to the left, and so we have to be constantly aware of which way the wind is sort of blowing us, so we stay in the middle of the road. And so that's why whenever we have thoughts that are puffing us up, we need to humble ourselves, which is resisting that. And whenever we have the opposite thoughts that are making us fall into despair, we have to encourage ourselves, say something that's encouraging. And so that's why Saint Silouan the Athonite, he in this thing, I'm sure I've said this before, I'll say it again, it's worth saying. He says there are two thoughts we need to be afraid of. One is that you're a saint, that you're saved, that you're 100% all set to heaven. And the other thought is that you're 100% set for hell, that you'll never be saved, that there's no hope. Because both of these are the extremes, and what we're trying to stay balanced in the middle and not go to either extreme. Okay, so we can move on to 146 now. And there's Isidore of Pelusium, another Isidore. And now in his first quote there, number 1, it said, "A life without a word is more advantageous than a word without life." In other words, life has to do with living the virtues, whereas a word is talking about the virtues. So what I'm doing here is I'm talking about the virtues, whereas what he's saying is it's better to have a life, in other words, to actually be living the virtues rather than talking about them. Because in the first case, if you're living the gospel commandments, if you're living a truly spiritual life, even if you're silent, it's helping yourself and other people who just by your example. Whereas the second case, where you're just talking about the spiritual life, it can be a trouble. It can be a problematic, because if you don't practice what you preach, then your words won't affect anybody. You'll be like a Pharisee. The Pharisees back in the time of Christ, they taught things perfectly. They knew the law of Moses inside out, and so they're great at teaching. But because they didn't practice what they preached, they weren't really their words weren't touching people. So, but he's saying ideally, what you have is both. Not only will you have a virtuous life, but you also have the ability to talk about it too. And so basically, he's just saying what we already know, that talk is cheap, and that it's what you do matters. And again, I'm sure this is something you've seen. You who are parents, that your parents, your children are going to listen to you only if you are practicing what you preach. If you tell your kids, don't waste time online, but you're on your phone all day, well, there's no way they're going to listen to you. So yeah. So I guess this time we can get up. So we're on page 146 now. I guess we can go up to page. I guess maybe just 156 for 10. So the next 10 pages we'll cover. So up to Isidore the priest for this next Saturday. All right. Well, it's great to see you. I hope you guys are all having a good struggle right during Lent, and you're taking advantage of all the extra church services and especially going to confession if you can. All right. So let's end now through the prayers of our Holy Fathers, of Jesus Christ, God.